I wore the sweater in the office this morning, and the homies said, Mr. Rogers called. He'd like his sweater back. This is like a Jesuit church. There's no clock at the back. I'm a Jesuit, and the homies don't really know what a Jesuit is, and exactly. And the Pope is a Jesuit, and I entered the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, many years ago. And every day at Homeboy, we have like 5 or 6 tour groups that come through, and the homies lead the tour groups. And in my office, if you've ever been to Homeboy, my office is glass enclosed, and so I can look out onto the floor of the reception area, and I have a full view. And 6 times a day, easily, a big group just parks right in front of my office. And it's, observe our founder in his natural habitat. And so I'm sitting there talking to a homie, and hi, how are you? And there was one day, this guy Gilbert came in, and he has what the homies call a loud-ass voice. And he said, and this is Father Greg Boyle. He's the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest. So I gave him my best moves. Anyway, it's a privilege to be with you. I'm so honored to have with me Jonathan from Homeboy Industries and his fiancée, Margaret. He was coaching me how to kind of put that little French spin, fiancé. I hope I did that justice. Anyway, I'm really honored to have you guys. You'll hear from him tomorrow. I always said, some of you have maybe heard me before. It always kind of freaks me out a little bit if even one person has ever heard me before. And I don't know why that bothers me, but years ago I was invited to speak to a whole bunch of foster grandparents in Orange County, and it was the big event they had every summer. And so I spoke at it one summer. Well, they invited me the next summer, and I thought, why are they inviting me? It's the same people, same talk probably. And so afterwards, a grandmother came up to me, and she had tears in her eyes, so I think she liked the talk. And she grabbed both my hands, and she said, I heard you last year. It never gets better. So kind of hoping, she misspoke there. Not entirely sure. So here's what I think brings you out to an evening like this and for this weekend. It's about wanting to imagine the world looking differently than it currently looks. That somehow you want to align your heart with the heart of our God, and allowing somehow God's dream to come true, that we be one. And so Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? In the end, what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said about our time together this weekend, that it's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to imagine a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. You go from here to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine that no one is standing outside that circle. You go from here to dismantle the barriers that exclude. And so to that end, the only way to really do that is to inch our way out to the margins, wherever we are living. Because unless you stand at the margins, they'll never get erased. But once you locate yourself out at them, look under your feet, you'll see that they're starting to disappear because of where you chose to stand. And so you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, you have this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so we go to the margins, because no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality, no matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, they actually can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other. So I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. And so we go to the margins and we brace ourselves, because the world will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah says, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You go to the margins and other voices get heard. Well, I think none of that really makes any sense were it not for our kind of expansive and spacious notion of who our God is. Teresa of Avila always said, our notion of God is a jar that we have to keep breaking. And the reason is because we shouldn't be able to contain it in a jar. So you have to, it's like the Jaws movie, we're gonna need a bigger boat. You need a bigger jar. St. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, always talked about the God who's always greater, because sometimes we've settled for a partial God instead of the God we actually have. I had a spiritual director many years ago who said to me once, "We need a better God than the one we have." He was a jiu-jitsu priest. But of course he's right if you think about it, because we get confined by this tiny, puny notion, and there's nothing more consequential than your notion of God, because otherwise we're sort of doomed. If your God is puny and tiny and exacting and judgmental, if your God shakes his head and wags his finger, if your God thinks you never measure up, you will be this in the world. You won't have much choice. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and mystic, said many years ago, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." Now, we don't really believe that, because we think God has all sorts of agenda items other than that. But we've settled for a partial, puny God instead of the one we actually have. Mirabai Starr, who I recommend, she's a mystic and writes about mystics. And she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods. And that's what's supposed to happen. And that's how we evolve and mature as people who believe in the God who loves us without measure and without regret. The homies for 35 years have taught me everything of value, and they've taught me essentially this kind of spacious, expansive, open-hearted God in a way that I never learned any other place. A lot of times they would teach me by way of mangling the English language, which I always find very charming and illuminating at the same time. But it happens all the time. A homegirl I remember once came in named Lisa, and she was one of our trainees in our 18-month training program, and she came in and her man came to pick her up at the end of the day, and she wanted to introduce him to me, and she said, "This is my sufficient other." And I said, "No doubt." Homeboy has grown quite large, and so we're a $23 million annual operation, and I'm heartened not to have to run it anymore. I have a CEO who does now, and so I can be in Santa Barbara, But I had a homie, one of the trainees, come in one morning. He says, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so I kind of know what she's going through." But more to the point of the point I'm trying to make, I was at Juvenile Hall, actually in San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and we were in a gym and 500 gang members in there, and I'm saying Mass, and I have my alb and my stole, and they have these sheets, these pages that have readings in English and Spanish, and so you could read along. And I said, "I'm not going to read along. I'm going to close my eyes and hear the word proclaimed." And homies one by one came up, and one guy did the first reading. Then the second guy came up to do the responsorial psalm, and there was a kind of an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he got up and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I looked at the sheet, I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if you stop to think about it, if any one of us happened to be God, we would all want to be exalted, because we're always projecting onto God who we are, always. Annie Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do, So that's where you want to kind of keep a distance from that. But the exhausted God, if you think about it, like let's say your grandparents and your grandkids came to visit on the weekend. You said, "Wow, we had the grandkids this weekend and we're pooped." But it's a good pooped. You know exactly what it is. It's about generosity. It's about expansive spirit. It's about God saying, "No, it's not about me. It's about you." Incredible. And yet we've settled for this tinier version. And there is nothing more consequential than the God we've chosen to embrace, the notion of God. 2 years ago, I buried my 92-year-old mama, and she had 8 kids, 5 girls and 3 boys. I had buried my father 25 years ago. And she died just the way, we would want to die, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids. And she was sharp as a tack, even to the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, just the 3 weeks or so before she died, she said to me with exhilaration, "I've never done this before." It was like exactly what you would say before jumping out of a plane, skydiving, And in fact, her last words to me, the day before she died, I just happened to be alone by her bedside, which never happened. And she was asleep, and she woke up and she saw me there, and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died, and I'm going, "Sorry." Well, the next day, as rare as this was, there I was again, the only one there. And I have to tell you, this never happened. But it was exactly noon, and she was kind of asleep, I guess. And she woke her eyes, and her eyes were wide, and she let out this tiny, wondrous, glorious gasp. And she left us, skydiving. And nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But in the last weeks of her life, there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 or all 8 of her kids around her bed, and she'd be in and out. But when she came in, she'd lock on to one of us and she'd have this singular focus. And she'd say with breathless delight, "Ah, you're here, you're here." And when I buried her, I remembered that and I thought, I think that may well be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, is just to look at you and say, you're here, you're here. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. This is not the God who wants anything from you, only for you. Why is that so hard for us to understand? Every parent and grandparent in this room, you don't want anything from your kids. You only want for them. That's the exhausted God. That's the one who's, it's about you. You're here. And so you receive the tender glance and then you don't know what to do with it except to be the tender glance in the world. We're invited to go from here to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, kindness. You don't go to the margins to make a difference because then it's about you. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And then it's about us. Otherwise, there's distance in service, and service is good, and service is where we begin. But service is the hallway that leads to the ballroom, which is the place of kinship and connection. You want to get to the ballroom. You don't want the distance of service provider, service recipient. I was in Houston once, and after a talk, a guy came up to me who was a former gang member, tattooed, and now he was working with gangs in the streets of Houston, and he pleaded with me, how do you reach them? And I found myself saying to him, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? How do we somehow turn this thing on its head from our notion of God, our notion of service? We have like 500 volunteers at Homeboy Industries, and once a woman came to me and she says, I have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries. I said, why do you have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries? She says, I believe I have a message these young people need to hear. I said, yikes. I said, do me a favor, the minute you lose that message, I hope you come back. Because they don't want your damn message. Can you receive people? Can you allow your heart to be altered? Otherwise, there's still distance, service provider, service recipient. No homie found more job opportunities at Homeboy Industries than this guy we all called Dreamer. And I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the housing projects in Pico Gardens. He got into a gang, one of the smartest homies I've ever known, with a dangerous sense of humor, which I always loved. He's in his 40s now, married, in recovery, good job, house, kids. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of getting locked up, and he'd come out and I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our social enterprises at Homeboy Industries. And in no time at all, he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. And it was a very frustrating and repetitious pattern. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation at county jail, and there he was sitting in front of my desk, and he says what gang members often say, this time it'll be different. I went, all right. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone. I called a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And he hired homies in the past, and I'm hoping against hope, maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, Gary says, you tell that guy he can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in my office. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again." But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly. And he says, "Damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." And "Oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God, yeah. You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh, God's number one." He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have been struck down your ass already by now." Well, the thing I most remember was the two of us, we just fell out of our chairs howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was like the best listener of anybody I'd ever been with. And if you were talking to him, nobody else existed. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if the mayor was on the approach. No. He was the embodiment of, "You're here, you're here." But once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar shrugged his shoulders and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual. And there is no distance that separates the service provider from the service recipient. When you allow yourself to be reached and your heart altered when you go out to the margins, and then you nurture and foster a culture that insists on a community of kinship and a circle of compassion where no one is outside that circle." And endlessly, the homies have taught me about kinship, enemies working side by side with each other, and they've taught me about how to get along and how to accommodate yourself and how you surrender to a community of tenderness. But in the last many years, they've taught me how to text, and I'm so grateful to them because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty dexterous at it, LOL and OMG and BTW, and the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, "Oh, hell no." And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. I know I can't be alone in being vexed by this autocorrect thing, and I remember I had a homegirl named Bertha who, a tough cookie, sold drugs for a long time, was in prison, worked at Homeboy after all that. And then on one Sunday she texted me and she said, "Where are you at?" And so I texted her back, "I am about to speak to a room full of monjas." And monjas is Spanish for sisters, nuns, religious women. "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." And I pushed send, and autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas, which she thought was, pretty interesting. And the homies are always blowing my phone up and texting me with their hair on fire, and I'm the priest they mistook for an ATM machine. And so, they're going to cut off my lights, or my car note is due, and I'm back pay on this. And once a homie texted me, and he just needed $100 to finish off his rent, and I didn't have it. So I wrote simply, "Things are tight." And I pushed send, and autocorrect told him, "Thongs are tight." And he wrote back, sorry to hear that. What about my rent? So one morning we were at morning meeting, and every morning from 10 minutes to 9 till 9, we gather hundreds and hundreds of gang members who work at Homeboy Industries, and we have announcements, and we have a thought for the day and a prayer, and we sing happy birthday and all that kind of stuff, And heaven won't be different than the morning meeting at Homeboy Industries. So right after it ended, I grabbed these two guys, Manuel and Poncho, to take them to help me give a talk in Palm Desert at a high school. So Manuel's in the front seat and Poncho's in the back. We're 15 minutes on the road when Manuel gets an incoming text, and he reads it to himself and he chuckles. And I say, well, what is it? He goes, oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazo, a big hug as the day began. Snoopy and Manuel worked together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our workers, all gang members. It's a tough job. I wouldn't want it, actually, because this may come as a surprise, but gang members can occasionally be attitudinal. So I said, what's he say? Oh, it's dumb. Hang on, let me find it. Here it is. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy. Oh my God, we howled. And I nearly drove into oncoming traffic. And then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. And now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? If you go to the original covenant, God says to God's people, as I have loved you, now the exalted God would say, love me back, which is what we would say if we were God. But that's not what the exhausted God says. As I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow and the orphan and the stranger. These are the folks who in that time were told by society, we can live without you. And God identifies the widow, orphan, and stranger because God thinks these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are the folks who happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to a community of kinship. We don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the widow, orphan, and stranger make us different. And we go to the margins to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And fortunate for us, there are only 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. We go to the margins to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And that's it. Only those 4 things. They're big things. So parentheses, Homeboy was born a long time ago in 1988 when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, they comprised the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other. The LAPD then deemed my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere. If LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And 2 weeks ago, I buried my 252nd, a young man named Alex. So we did a lot of things. The first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. So they were wreaking havoc in the middle of the day, writing on walls, selling drugs. They were violent. So I would walk out to them in the projects and I would sort of isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, I would. And then I, couldn't find a school that would take them. So that kind of forced my hand. So across the street from the church is our elementary school, parochial school, grades K to 8, which filled the first 2 floors of the building. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns in the living room one evening and I sat them down and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And I remember they looked at each other and they just said, sure, just like that. That was the extent of their discernment process. And so gang members came in large numbers to the church property, not to church, but to the church property. And that created a disconnect. People in the parish would sidle up to me and say, hey, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out. And I thought that was a good gospel challenge. And then the homie said, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, because there were only women with children really who lived in the housing projects, we marched around the factories that surrounded the projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So then we invented things, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, a crew to remove graffiti, all made up of members of the 8 warring gangs. Then in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles ignited and exploded, except the poorest pocket. My parish didn't. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, so they came and asked me, and I said, well, maybe partly it was because we had 60 strategically hired gang members from these 8 warring gangs, and they had a reason to get up in the morning, and they worked side by side with their enemies, and they had a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, they had a reason not to torch their own community. So the article appeared the next day. Well, the following day, I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he said, how should I spend my money? And as I look back on it now, I see that I woefully undershot my request. I was young. I had hair. So I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from the school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work. You could fix them. I don't know. We could put hairnets on rival enemy gang members, and I don't know, they could bake bread, and we could call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my entire business plan. And he said, sure. So we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, We changed the name of our organization, which was called Jobs for a Future, and we turned it into Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. And not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we've evolved, we've backed our way into becoming now the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet. So 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. And they come through our doors and they want to find healing. You know, our program is not for those who need help, it's only for those who want it. Every homie who walks through our doors comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightening or frightened, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And so the first stop on any path to transformation is a safe place. And so gang members find a sanctuary there. And then after a time, they become the sanctuary that they sought. Then they go home and they present this sanctuary to their kids. And for the first time, you've broken a cycle. And they all come burdened with backpacks filled with chronic toxic stress. They all come barricaded behind a wall of shame. And only tenderness can scale that wall. In the old days, we were nothing stops a bullet like a job, and we were job-centric. That was probably our first 15 years. And then once you know gang members, you know, yeah, well, an employed gang member may or may not go back to prison, or an educated one may or may not. But it has become our absolute complete guarantee that a healed gang member will not ever reoffend, ever. And once they gain this resilience, once they are no longer strangers to themselves, then they leave us after 18 months. And the world will throw at them what it will, but this time they won't be toppled. So we have therapy. We have 4 paid therapists, but 49 volunteer therapists, including 3 psychiatrists. We have case management navigators. We have free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic, 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, and 43 volunteer doctors. We have all our training programs, solar panel installation training, all our social enterprises, Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegirl merchandise. We have a restaurant at LAX Terminal 4. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall. Homeboy Recycling, which is electronic waste, farmers markets. Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole in a variety of venues. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. And they cater. It's kind of a who's who. It's breakfast and lunch. If you go either of those meals, you're going to bound to run into some movie star or an elected, Jim Carrey, Jack Black, Forrest Whitaker, Jane Fonda. Once, with only 2 hours notice from the Secret Service, when he was vice president, Joe Biden came, motorcade, entourage, selfies with Uncle Joe. And once Diane Keaton came, Oscar winner, movie star, Godfather movies, Annie Hall. Her waitress was Glinda, and Glinda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, felon, parolee, gang member. She has no idea who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glinda rattles off the 3 dishes that she really likes, and Diane Keaton says, well, I'll take that second one. That one sounds good. And it's at that moment, for some reason, something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton deflects it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that just took my breath away, and I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly, Kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And we need go no further than to hear Jesus say the words, that you may be one. I suppose he could have been more self-referential, but like the exhausted God he wants to align his heart with, it's not about him, it's about us. That you may be one. This is God's dream come true. My joy, yours, your joy complete. This is a God who doesn't want anything from you, only for you. And once you know that, once you receive that tender glance, all you want to do is be the tender glance. Every single one of us is invited to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're really allergic to holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up because, well, our exhausted God never asks this of us. Why should we ask it of each other? The Buddhists say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." The homies at Homeboy Industries always say, we're used to being watched. We're not used to being seen. Long lay the world in sin and error pining till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. And yeah, it's about Jesus, and yeah, it's about Christmas. But how is it not the job description of every single one of us? You appear and the soul feels its worth. You hold the mirror up and you tell people the truth. It is the truth we all share, our own unshakable goodness. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks at the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But we all have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that keep people from seeing their truth. For the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. I would invite you, as that quote that we read, it stems from one line in the Acts of the Apostles, and it says simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So a number of years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. It's what we call in the biz a gang in-service. And so it's for social workers, and you get credit, and they They take over a kind of a hotel ballroom, and they have to sign in and get credits. And it's from 9 to 5, and there are keynotes and breakout sessions and workshops. So they invited me. I said yes, figuring, maybe I'd do a keynote at lunch or something, and I bought my ticket. A week before I was to fly, I pull out the letter that originally invited me, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day, and I said to myself, oh, hell no. So I invited 2 homies in, trainees in our 18-month trainee program, Andre and Jose, and both of them were like at midpoint, like their 9th month. And I sit them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and I guess he's like 25 years old, and gang member, tattooed, been to prison. We have different phases of our trainees. They work in different parts of our organization. And at that moment, he had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. Now he's helping homies and homegirls with their own addiction issues. So not only did he have a stretch in prison, he had a stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. Literally, we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. But then he continued, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid, and she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. For an idea has taken root in the world. It's at the root of all that's wrong with it. And the idea would be this: that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. We stand against that idea. We go from this place to stand against it. Years ago, I was invited by the Christian Broadcast Network to be interviewed by this woman, and she asked me, well, what do you do at Homeboy Industries? And I told her all the things I told you, from job placement to job training to community of tenderness. I told her that if it's true that the traumatized will cause trauma and the damaged will cause damage, Homeboy believes that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and each other. I told her about therapy and case management and navigation. I told her about our 60 different classes, from anger management to parenting to meditation. I told her about our alternative school. I told her that Homeboy was like the front porch of the house all of us long to live in. That it's not so much about talking about the light, but it's about choosing to be a light by which folks can see. I told her about enemies working side by side with each other in bakeries and a variety of businesses. Anyway, I went on and on. When I finished, she kind of made a face and she looked at me and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day, at Homeboy Industries? Praising God. And I didn't know what to say. So I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question, and I'll finish with this. What kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So it occurs to universities in particular to force their students to read my books against their will. And I'm not complaining, but my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, formerly number 1, now number 2. In any case, they're going to ruin my bracket like they do every March. But so they invited me. They said, we've asked the incoming freshmen all to read Tattoos on the Heart. Can you come and speak? And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I do, if people are going to pay for it. And I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick rivals, enemies from different neighborhoods, gangs. Just, to force them to share a hotel room together, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of watching gang members panicked in the sky. A number of years ago, I remember I had 2 older vatos, and we were at LAX. We were flying to DC, and one of them, dead serious, said, "AG, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time?" I said, well, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked these two homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who at the time worked in our bakery, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. And I've done this almost 1,000 times with men and women. I've never picked anybody like this guy, Mario, who was just petrified, terrified, to the bone terrified. In fact, it was starting to freak me out a little bit. He was, hyperventilating. I had never seen anybody do that. He was like that, and, we hadn't even boarded the plane. And so we were at Burbank Airport, and, it's a small airport and big bay windows, Southwest Airlines, big planes, but they don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to board the front of the plane. And the big feature at Burbank, of course, are the steps to board the back of the plane. And so I'm there sitting with Mario. Bobby's off exploring the airport. And our plane arrives. It's early morning, and people are deplaning. And, I turn to Mario. I say, well, that's going to be our plane. Like this, I think, wow, he may die before we climb those stairs. And then I see our flight crew arrives, the pilots and the flight attendants, and there were two female flight attendants, both of them with very large cups of Starbucks coffee. And they're schlepping up the front steps to board the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? And I say, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots, there they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in our 32-year history as an organization, nobody has ever been more tattooed than this guy Mario, which is saying something. He's all sleeved out to his fingertips with tattoos, neck blackened with the name of his gang from jawbone to collarbone, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that, when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody, and so I'm walking him through the airport trying to calm him down. I'd never been in public with him, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. I'm going, wow. Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday, walk up to anybody who works there and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They won't say me. They'll think for half a beat and say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario works in the cafe now. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that the highest form of spiritual maturity is tenderness. It is the only thing that can scale the wall. So we get to Gonzaga, and of course there's the big talk Tuesday night, as promised, 1,000 people. What they don't tell you all day Tuesday is that they have 93 other talks planned for you. This meeting, this lunch, this class, all day. So I tell Mario and Bobby, I'm not going to speak in any of these. You get up, and I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. And so they get up, and they're nervous, especially Mario is, of course, very panicky. But they do a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime comes, and it's, as promised, 1,000 people. And so I coax them to get up in front of me for, 7 minutes each and give a snapshot of their life. And then gave my thing, and then I had them stand on either side of me for question and answer. And yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario steps up to the microphone and he clutches it, and he's a tall, skinny drink of water, and he's just petrified, and he says, yes. And she says, well, Mario, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone even more intently. And I can sense he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. And when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears. But he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. But let there be no doubt that everyone standing had been returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. That we go to the margins and we look each other in the eyes and we refuse to watch because we only want to see. Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. And everybody is inhabiting their unshakable goodness in each other's presence. And suddenly kinship so quickly, and the soul feels its worth because we look at each other and we say, you're here, you're here. And so we go out to the margins to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it, and to imagine a circle of compassion and imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And soon enough, we all cease to care if anyone accuses us of wasting our time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.